series of webinars that we are delivering to the national scale, on the global scale, around education, hosted by ETIC. And with no further ado, please, you may start your presentation, and we are all listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Siri. Thank you very much for that kind introduction and for the invitation to speak at this webinar series. My presentation today will focus on technical and vocational education and training systems. These are also sometimes referred to as workforce development or skills development systems. So these systems usually encompass secondary, vocational, or post-secondary non-tertiary education. And in some contexts, they can also include short-term training for youth and adults. So since spring of this year, more than 1.2 billion of students around the world have been affected by the COVID-19 related school closures. Such closures, of course, have affected students pursuing technical and vocational training as well. As of 2018, according to United Nations Institute of Statistics, there were more than 73 million TVET students, more than 3/4 of them pursuing upper secondary education. So the vast majority of these students have not been able to return to their classrooms in the recent months. Compared to other levels of education, TVET has some distinctive features, such as its proximity to the labor market, both in terms of students' aspirations, but also in terms of their focus on practical skills and the relatively shorter duration of training compared to other education levels. These features, among others, present some additional challenges for TVET systems during COVID-19, but they also present some unique opportunities for this sector. So in this presentation, I will first discuss some factors that make TVET particularly challenging in the context of this global pandemic. I will then show you the results of the survey that we were conducting jointly with ILO and UNESCO that tried to understand how TVET systems are faring during this crisis. And then I will propose that TVET systems can have a very key role in mitigating the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis, and they can also contribute to the post-crisis recovery. And I will lead you through some specific actions that TVET systems either have already taken or can take in the next phases of the crisis to actually make that contribution happen. So what factors contribute to the challenges faced by TVET systems during this pandemic? First, students who enroll in TVET tend to be more disadvantaged compared to their peers in secondary, general, or tertiary education. In Ghana and Kenya, for example, TVET students tend to come from lower socioeconomic status compared to students in general education track, and this status was measured by parents' education levels. This relative disadvantage can imply that TVET students have less access to connectivity or to digital devices that are so essential for remote learning. They might also be even more vulnerable now that they cannot get access to social services that are usually provided by schools. The second challenge comes from the focus of TVET on practical skills. Remote learning cannot really substitute well for the type of learning by doing that happens usually in school-based workshops and labs, or that happens through hands-on work-based learning. Even if learning were to happen while TVET institutions are closed, remote certification of practical skills presents its own challenges. Of course, the magnitude of these challenges differs. It differs by occupation, and it differs by the theory versus practice split of a specific program. TVET programs that rely more on academic knowledge or that rely more on using computers can transition more easily to remote learning. So this could apply to programs such as, for example, cybersecurity or marketing or customer service training. On the other hand, programs that rely on imparting manual skills or that require practice with expensive equipment, such as automobile mechanics, would have a tougher transition to remote learning. Finally, there's a political economy angle, with TVET institutions often having lower resources and lower capacity compared to institutions at other education levels. So very much understandably, the attention of policymakers and the media has so far focused very sharply on the youngest learners to make sure that they continue learning during this pandemic. On the other side of the education spectrum, higher education institutions, such as universities, have the resources and capacity usually to develop appropriate mitigation strategies to support their learners. As for TVET, additional efforts may be needed to make sure that it is included in the overall education response to the crisis. This is particularly the case where in contexts where the TVET mandate is separate from that for primary and secondary and perhaps even tertiary education. And this is the case in some of our client countries. So with this context in mind, we have joined forces with ILO and UNESCO to conduct a survey of TVET providers, policymakers, and social partners to understand how TVET institutions are addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. This online survey was conducted from April 3rd to May 15th of this year, and it was available in 8 languages, including Arabic. We have received more than 1,300 responses from 126 countries, including a couple of responses from Saudi Arabia. What I will present to you in the next few slides is based on preliminary analysis of the data. It was conducted right after we finalized data collection. We're currently working with ILO and UNESCO on further data analysis, and the final report will be expected to come out later this year. So as you can see on the chart, on the pie chart on the screen, more than 3/4 of our survey respondents actually represented TVET providers, both initial and continuing. 11% of responses came from ministry staff, either Ministry of Labor or Ministry of Education and TVET. And another 5% came from national and regional training authorities. The first question we asked, perhaps naturally, was, has your country closed TVET colleges or training centers? As expected, the vast majority of respondents reported that TVET institutions in their country were completely closed at the time of the survey. Just to remind you, the survey was conducted in April and May, which saw a rapid rise of infection rates around the world. It is notable, however, that in some regions, such as Asia and the Pacific and the Americas, about 5 to 6% of respondents reported that only some of the activities were shut down. This was reported in mainly East Asian and Southeast Asian countries, such as Cambodia, China, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, the Philippines, Korea, Thailand, and Vietnam, but also in countries in other regions, such as Ecuador, Nigeria, Pakistan, Lebanon, and Ukraine. Another key finding from the survey is that the response to shuttering of physical classrooms has differed greatly across countries. This difference is likely related to some of the factors that I described earlier in terms of challenges faced by TVET systems. As you can see on the top graph, almost 90% of respondents from countries in Europe and Central Asia reported that training has switched to fully remote modality. This is either online or offline, but not face-to-face. With only 3% of respondents reporting that training had to be canceled altogether. Respondents from Americas and Arab states were more likely to report canceling training, but still over 70% of respondents reported switching to remote learning. The responses from Asia and the Pacific are notable because of the higher share of partially remote instruction, which makes sense because, as we saw in previous slide, they were the ones that only shut down some activities. So that's why they could do partial remote instruction. And still in these countries, the share of respondents reporting canceling training is quite low at 10%. Compared to all other regions, the picture from Africa is striking. Only 22% of respondents reported that their institutions shifted to fully remote learning. And about half of all respondents said that training had to be canceled because no options for online or offline distance learning was available. As one might expect from these results, the reported switch to remote learning correlates highly with country income. And you can see this on the bottom graph. In more than 85% of high-income countries, the median respondent reported transitioning to fully remote learning. The share goes down to 70% of countries for upper middle income countries and to 35% for lower middle income countries. As for low income countries, in only 5% of these countries did the median respondent report a switch to fully remote learning. This demonstrates a very wide gap in resources and capacities of TVET institutions to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And naturally, this will only increase the pre-existing inequities in TVET education between countries. In addition, inequities are being potentially magnified within countries due to the type of remote learning that is becoming available. As you can see in the top graph, close to half of all respondents report that training in their institutions has switched to only online learning platforms. On the other hand, less than a third report that both online and offline formats are being used. Zooming in a bit more on this, in the bottom graph, we see that respondents reported investments in many online and high-tech tools, such as video conferencing, YouTube and other videos, virtual learning environments, blogs and discussion forums, simulators, virtual or augmented reality tools. At the same time, less than a quarter of respondents report investments in offline resources, such as developing or distributing new written resources, and less than 10% report using TV or podcasts. This can imply that while privileged students can continue learning even remotely, the more disadvantaged students, those with poor connectivity or lack of personal digital devices, are being cut off from learning opportunities by the digital divide. Of course, the challenge of access versus quality of remote learning is not unique to TVET. But it is important to point out that equity needs to be taken seriously when new investments are considered to ensure that all students have access to remote learning opportunities. Despite these challenges, TVET can play a significant role during the three different phases of the COVID-19 crisis. Before discussing the specific actions that TVET systems can focus on in each of the phases, let me give you a brief overview. So we call the first phase the coping phase. This is when TVET institutions and many businesses are closed, and the health emergency is at its peak. During this phase, the main objectives are to reduce the potential learning losses and to contribute to the emergency response by upskilling essential workers and reskilling other workers so they can contribute to the response as well. The second phase is called managing continuity. And it is when institutions, TVET institutions and businesses gradually begin to reopen. TVET institutions can then focus their efforts on learning recovery and on setting the foundation for contributing to the economic recovery. Finally, the third phase is building back better. And this is when opportunities open up to reimagine, reset, and redo workforce training. During this phase, TVET systems can scale up innovations that have been developed during COVID-19. They can also review and reinvent some programs so that they can provide training with higher relevance, higher quality, one that is accessible to all students, and one that is ready to weather future potential crises. In doing that, TVET can ensure that firms emerging from the crisis have access to the skills that they need to rebuild and recover. Now let us look at the specific actions TVET systems either have taken or can take in the future during each phase to meet their potential and fulfill their mandate. The coping phase started with school closures sometime in the spring in most countries. And the first priority for all education institutions, including those of TVET, has been to reduce learning losses. As most TVET institutions did not have comprehensive contingency plans in place, the best they could do in the moment is to switch to remote learning in an ad hoc manner. This could mean quickly developing different modalities such as online, TV, radio, phone, peer-to-peer learning, printed materials to support students continuing to learn. For example, the government in Senegal developed online distance learning courses for TVET and has been working to broadcast courses over television and radio to reach rural youth who do not have access to the internet. European Union member states have used everything from simple messaging services like WhatsApp to TV broadcasts, online video learning channels, video conference systems, and elaborate learning and collaboration platforms. To make sure that students continue learning, some systems have turned to off-the-shelf packages from third parties, like courses offered on Coursera or Commonwealth of Learning platforms, even if some of them were developed for students from different levels of education. Finally, in some countries, when learning in classrooms stopped, work-based learning continued, either on-site or remotely. This was the case in the spring for some EU countries, such as France, Belgium, Ireland, and Germany. In the Netherlands, for example, students in secondary TVET programs could continue their work-based learning unless government or sectoral guidelines prevented them to do so, or unless the TVET provider or the student decided to pause the workforce placement. Of course, the switch to remote learning can be supported by teachers who are prepared to work in the new modality. This makes teacher training a crucial ingredient in making this transition successfully. Such training can focus on helping instructors develop approaches to reach as many students as possible to make sure they continue learning. It can also train instructors to use available remote learning platforms effectively and enhance their digital skills. For example, in Armenia, the National Center for Educational Technology Development has cooperated with the NGO National Network for Distance Learning to provide remote training to teachers from technical colleges and craftsmanship schools. When closures of TVET institutions continue, the emergency response of the initial weeks can transform into a more sophisticated approach to remote learning. This means that teachers can be already better prepared to conduct lessons remotely, using both synchronous and asynchronous approaches. Training packages can become better aligned to the pre-COVID curriculum, and new assessment approaches can be developed to fit the new normal. Time can also fix inequities in access to remote learning via improving connectivity and distributing digital devices. potentially by creating new public-private partnerships. For example, the World Bank is currently supporting the TVET authority in Afghanistan in ensuring continuity of learning via a variety of distance learning channels, such as TV, radio, flash drives, CDs, and provision of devices, and making sure that it's tailored to Afghanistan's economic, geographic, and security context. Finally, as students get nearer graduation, many creative approaches to certifying skills are being undertaken so that students can enter the labor market. Some countries like France have canceled most TVET exams and instead based grades on continuous assessments. Others, like Caribbean countries participating in the Caribbean Vocational Qualifications exam, conducted by the Caribbean Examinations Council, have transitioned to virtual assessment modality, with virtual review of portfolios and virtual stakeholder assessments. Notably, besides reducing learning losses for current TVET students, prolonged lockdowns of institutions and businesses may present unique opportunities to upskill and reskill furloughed and laid off workers during their idle time. There are learning platforms that are stepping up to offer solutions for this purpose. For example, Mexico has a Capacitate para el Empleo online platform, and it is currently offering free access to its hundreds of courses and several diploma degrees for technical occupations. There have been already partnerships developed between this platform and organizations in Central American countries such as Honduras and Guatemala to provide them access to this platform. Coursera has launched a workforce recovery initiative for governments that enables free access to all their courses for the unemployed workers. This initiative, though, is a limited time offer. Governments have to sign up by September 30th, and students have to complete their courses by December 31st. In some contexts, idle workers can also be engaged in creative ways. They can be engaged to provide remote instructions to current TVET students, or they can be connected to TVET instructors to update them on current industry practices. So what makes TVET particularly relevant for contributing to the coping phase of the COVID-19 crisis is that its students are closer to the labor market in two senses. First, they're more likely to expect to work right after graduation, compared, say, to students in secondary general or university education who might want to obtain additional education when they finish. Second, TVET is usually of shorter duration, which means that more students at any time are closer to graduation. So how can TVET contribute to the emergency response itself? First, it may reskill or upskill workers in critical sectors, such as the care services, be it healthcare, elder care, or childcare, and other essential services, to make them more effective in preventing the spread of COVID-19. This has been done in previous pandemics. So during the Ebola outbreak of 2014 and 2015, Sierra Leone set up a national Ebola training academy to offer a platform for clinical training modules for frontline Ebola healthcare workers. During COVID-19, so this pandemic, the Generation Program, which is a nonprofit organization set up by McKinsey, has rolled out short online modules to upskill healthcare workers to treat and provide care for COVID-19 patients in India, Italy, France, and Mexico. In certain contexts, TVET instructors and current students can be directly engaged in the emergency response. For example, in Turkey, vocational schools were reported to collaborate with the private sector on the design and production of surgical masks and disinfectants. Respondents to our ILO UNESCO World Bank survey that I presented earlier also reported some creative efforts to engage TVET students and facilities in the response. A respondent from Thailand, for example, reported that TVET institutions have been asked to produce and distribute hand sanitizer among local communities. A respondent in Indonesia listed efforts to initiate trainings for medical equipment technicians, other healthcare workers, as well as garment factory workers and call center workers. As TVET institutions and businesses start reopening for in-person instruction, the objective of TVET shifts to learning recovery. One of the most important actions is to ensure that reopening workplaces and classrooms is conducted safely. This means updating and enforcing hygiene and sanitation procedures, inspecting physical infrastructure to ensure proper physical distancing, and upgrading ventilation systems. It also means thinking seriously about sequencing reopening based on needs and contexts. For example, students could be split in smaller groups, with some having in-person workshops or lab-based classes, while others are doing remote learning for the theory-based part of the curriculum. It could also mean providing alternative options, where students that have access to connectivity and digital devices can opt to continue learning remotely, while in-person instruction is prioritized for those who do not have the necessary equipment for remote learning. Related to this is the very real concern of student dropout, which is expected to happen during COVID-19 crisis. Some students may simply feel that they have fallen too far behind during school closures. Others had to enter the labor market to support their family income. It is important to recognize and communicate that permanent disengagement and training may result in lifetime earnings losses. It can also result in system-wide losses in productivity. So it is very important to encourage students to return to education. For this to work, TVET systems can offer flexible training options that would enable students to re-enter education on their own terms. Particularly if they have to continue working part-time to support their families. The first step would be to identify the specific needs of students who may be vulnerable to dropout and to provide them with tailored support, be it financial, such as scholarships or tuition delays, or offers of tutoring assistance. Importantly, impacts of the crisis on mental health and motivation need to be addressed. For some students, this could imply just a simple reassurance of safety or brief motivational messages. But for others, targeted psychosocial counseling may be needed to support their return to studies. After reopening, the main job of TVET institutions is to begin learning recovery, to get students back to their pre-COVID learning trajectory. The first task in this regard is to assess the individual learning status of returning students, considering that students may have had unequal access to remote learning. For those who were able to continue learning, either through formal instruction or through gaining valuable work experience, it will be important to have mechanisms to recognize and potentially certify that learning and the obtained skills. For those who experience learning losses relative to their pre-COVID trajectory, remedial measures might need to be implemented, such as encouraging more differentiated instruction in the classroom, holding additional tutoring sessions, and developing individual learning plans that would enable students to catch up to their classmates. Finally, during this phase of the crisis, TVET systems can lay the foundation for their contribution to post-crisis economic recovery. This can be done by conducting rapid skills assessments to understand the skills needs that are likely to emerge after the crisis. Such rapid assessments can be facilitated by robust pre-existing labor market information systems, such as the ones in Australia and United Kingdom. They can also rely on direct engagement with local employers, which affords an additional opportunity to build that relationship, which is so important for TVET systems. Another step that can prepare TVET systems to contribute to the economic rebound is to review the relevant regulation and make sure that there are no unnecessary obstacles that would prevent skill systems from responding efficiently to the emerging needs. This could refer to the ability to change training content as needed and the ability to facilitate work-based learning. During the final third stage of crisis response, the focus of TVET systems is on building back better, using lessons learned and innovations implemented during COVID-19. The first aspect for ensuring the effective and resilient TVET is to improve the responsiveness of programs to labor market needs. This can be accomplished by maintaining or deepening the engagements with different stakeholders, such as employers or local government officials that have been initiated during the crisis. By doing so, TVET institutions can become part of the decision-making process. So when recovery plans are elaborated, they can actually have a seat at the table and take part in reskilling those who have lost jobs in the hardest hit sectors, such as tourism and hospitality, for example. Likewise, in addressing learning losses experienced by current students during the pandemic, presents an opportunity to review and revise TVET programs' curricula, ensuring that sufficient attention is paid to foundational cognitive, socio-emotional, and digital skills, all of which are so highly valued by employers. And given the urgency of crisis and post-crisis response, there will be greater demand for shorter and more modular training that would enable students to stack their credentials and continue their learning even after they enter the workforce, enabling truly lifelong learning. The second aspect of building back better focuses on inclusion. The COVID-19 crisis provides an opportunity not only to re-engage with current students, but also to engage with new groups of learners. TVET can provide an attractive option for students who may have dropped out of secondary, general, or even university education, because TVET has this potential to provide shorter and more modular training. As I presented earlier, workers who become idle during the crisis may also look to TVET for opportunities to upskill or reskill in order to enter the labor market after the crisis with better skills. But in order to effectively engage both new and returning learners, it is important that TVET institutions identify students' needs and provide them with tailored support. COVID-19 has demonstrated very vividly the breadth of the digital divide, as we saw in the slides about the different learning modalities for different TVET institutions around the world. So TVET institutions will have to figure out how to bridge that digital divide. Perhaps maintaining and strengthening partnerships with private sector stakeholders, some of which could have been initiated during the crisis, can help expand access to TVET learning opportunities and increase the flexibility of training after the crisis as well. Speaking of flexibility, learners will emerge from the crisis with different needs and constraints due to their work or family situations. Being able to respond to them by offering a flexible menu of options with flexible schedules, modalities, and pathways will be essential in retaining the current students and attracting new ones. Finally, from outreach to graduation, providing timely and user-friendly guidance on how to align training to students' career aspirations and how to ensure a smooth transition to the labor market after graduation will help set up TVET students for success. The pandemic has, of course, demonstrated the need to strengthen the preparedness and resilience of all education institutions, including those in TVET. Preparing for future crises can disrupt teaching and learning, and preparing can take several actions. First, TVET systems can invest in smart technologies. For example, developing content for online learning platforms, incorporating virtual and augmented reality tools and training, and e-portfolio skills accreditation tools. These technologies can enhance the learning experience and make it more flexible during the regular periods without the crisis. But during the crisis, they can also quicken the transition to crisis mode as needed. TVET systems can also invest in pre-service and in-service capacity building for TVET instructors so that they have the latest industry knowledge and skills, as well as pedagogical and digital skills needed to quickly adapt to remote instruction. Another way to ensure resilience in TVET is to mainstream data collection on student engagement and learning, be it face-to-face or remote, and actually use that data, not just collect it, but use it to improve the learning experience. This can help TVET to deliver on the promises made to students and employers on the quality and relevance of the provided training. And of course, one major lesson from COVID-19 is that it is better to have a contingency plan in place before the crisis strikes. So developing these plans already with the experience of COVID-19 and reviewing what has worked well and what did not work well, and considering what can be done differently in the next crisis will be very important. So just to sum up, the actions presented here aim to ensure that TVET systems around the world not only overcome these additional challenges that they had during the current crisis, but that they also contribute to the crisis response and post-crisis recovery, and that they become better prepared for building the skills of today's and tomorrow's workforce. I really look forward to your questions. Thank you so much. And I look forward to learning about how Saudi Arabian TVET institutions and system has responded to the crisis. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victoria. Actually, the journey was very exciting, and the way it was built actually is very systematic, not only in diagnosing the existing condition, but also putting some roadmap on how to recover and how to change. And let me ask the first question that comes to my mind here. We heard about structural changes that K-12 or higher education is going through during COVID-19, and these changes will not be temporary, but will be permanent. What permanent changes that we are expecting, first of all, to see in TVET post-COVID-19? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Asiri. Excellent question. We definitely expect to see greater flexibility. So we don't think that reopening will mean a complete return to in-person instruction 100% all the time. So especially in TVET, this flexibility, as I said, flexibility of schedules, flexibility of modalities will continue to be important. And I think many TVET institutions had to develop these approaches in an emergency fashion, but now they can use that experience to actually mainstream and think seriously about what they can keep in regular periods, what is working well. For example, I spoke to a president of a small community college in the US, and they said that they switched during the crisis to remote guidance system, both psychosocial and career guidance. And he said that these students have reported very positive feelings about that, and they're probably not switching back afterwards, or they might switch for some services, but not others. The importance of digital skills. I think we all have been talking about the importance of digital skills before the crisis, but the crisis has shown us that these skills are essential, especially during crisis modes. And the importance of social-emotional skills. Again, we have been talking about social-emotional skills before the crisis, but these social-emotional skills make the difference between students who can learn remotely, who have the perseverance and the drive to do it without going to the classroom every day, and those who cannot. So building those skills from the outset and making sure those skills are in place before the crisis strikes is extremely important. And there are many other aspects that we think will be different going forwards. And some of these are very positive aspects that we think that these changes have shown us the importance of preparedness, the importance of flexibility, and the importance of partnerships.
Excellent, thank you. We have a lot of questions here, but let me first take our first question through the mic from Mr. Ashraf Saeed. Mr. Ashraf, please, you can take the mic and ask your question directly. Thank you. Hello, we cannot hear you, Mr. Ashraf. You can raise your voice, please. No problem. You can type your question on the text and I will read it for you. So my next question, Victoria, is around the micro-credentials. We have been hearing about micro-credentials for a long time. And due to the crisis right now and the post-COVID-19 realities that we're going to live with, do you think that micro-credentials will turn from some kind of a fancy word that we use sometime here and there into the real type of TVET and the mainstream of TVET that is going on in training? And how do you see this is happening if we start going into the path of micro-credentials?
Thank you. I think this is the direction in which the TVET system is moving towards, because this allows that flexibility and it allows opportunities for people to engage in lifelong learning, truly lifelong, because they can always stack those credentials as they need to. So I think we also have now technologies that allow for this. We have the blockchain, we have different technologies that allow this this identification on a technical level of these credentials and making sure that they're affiliated with the right people. So I think the COVID-19 crisis will hopefully accelerate the movement in that direction. Of course, some systems are much better prepared to go down that path than other systems. So I think it depends a lot on the level of system development. But I do believe that this is the direction which we will be moving.
Excellent. And in terms of the partnerships, as you rightfully mentioned, between the labor market and TVET, do you see the labor markets going more into the TVET system itself and becoming an integral part of it, rather than being a system that is living outside the boundaries of the TVET system? When you mentioned things around the work-based learning and training, can you please elaborate on that? And if you can give us an example from the various countries that you have worked with, or maybe seen their experience in how these two worlds become more closer to each other and the transition becomes seamless between training and labor market, if not happening in the same time?
Sure, another excellent question. Thank you. I think it is vitally important, especially for TVET, to be closely engaged with the labor market, with the local labor market in particular. And this engagement can take many forms. Usually we think about either work-based placements, or we think about firms offering on-the-job training to their workers, but there are many forms in which labor market and TVET systems can collaborate, including, as I mentioned, from skills assessments. So participating in skills assessments where employers say, either in a formal way through a survey or an informal way, what are the skills needs that they're seeing in the short or medium term, or it can be updating the skills of the TVET instructors, right? So having TVET instructors participating inside the local businesses to make sure they understand the current industry practices and they can bring them back to the classroom. It can also be labor firms, for example, giving equipment to the TVET classrooms so that, again, graduates already know the type of equipment that the local firms are using. So there are a lot of different kinds of partnerships that can be built in that area. I think the best ones that I have seen in my work come from East Asia. So Singapore, Malaysia has done a good job in terms of collaboration between the skills development system and employers. Singapore, of course. So Singapore, Malaysia. Many EU countries have done a great job. I mean, people usually talk about Germany and Austria, but I just want to make sure that we expand the breadth of our examples in that area. Again, there are many different ways to collaborate besides the dual training that is usually mentioned, the Germany, Austria models.
Thank you very much. I have a number of questions here. Please allow me to read them. We have a first question from we have a question that's saying, are institutions flexible enough to deviate from some of the set policies regarding contact hours, and how this would impact the training and accreditation process?
I think that this is the point that I was making on regulation. So it is important to understand whether regulation at some point becomes an obstacle to the responsiveness of the skills development system. And again, crises in that sense present this unique opportunity to review and perhaps revise some of these regulations. So if the accreditation system, or if there's the labor regulation prevents, let's say, work-based learning, then this is a chance to review it.
Excellent. I have a question from Dr. Abdullah Al-Qata'i. Dr. Abdullah is asking what kind of evaluation you may suggest during the COVID-19. Evaluation, assessment, any sort of solutions for evaluation that should be used during COVID-19 and post-COVID-19 in the training sector.
I suppose this is about the assessment of skills that are being taught in TVET institutions. This depends on the country context, I would say. Again, some countries decided that they would rather cancel the examinations and the certifications that they usually have, because they didn't want to have the in-person examinations, and they felt that switching to any other form was too difficult. Others are trying to do online certification, and I discussed an example of the Caribbean Vocational Qualifications exam. So these are all approaches, particularly in TVET, given its practical skills focus. These are approaches that are at just emerging right now, especially on a large scale. But also some countries did go ahead and hold their in-person examination and certification. They prioritized that, for example, over continuing regular classes. So they just brought students in smaller groups with the necessary health and sanitation procedures in place to do the in-person assessment and to certify the skills of their current students.
Excellent, thank you. I see Mr. Ashraf Said trying to ask his question again. Please, you can take the mic. Thank you. Hello? So the next question is around the technology. We have seen lots of reports talking about e-learning, but the approach was similar to the approach that is taken towards K-12 and higher education, while we all know that almost 70% of the TVET qualifications and curriculums are skill-based. So do you think that the type of traditional e-learning that we are using for the other forms of education are sufficient enough for TVET? And if not, then what is missing? What are these components that we need to actually simulate maybe the skill or to provide a virtual reality? And if these are being used right now, can you shed some light on the countries that are using them, and where should we look actually for the best practices in that field?
Thank you. Yes, I think e-learning can substitute for some parts of TVET instruction, but not other parts, at least not yet. So for theory-based parts, I guess what you call the traditional e-learning could suffice. And what is being used for higher education or for general secondary education can work. Also, if for occupations where most of the skills are computer-based anyways, or digital device-based anyways, there's usually a very easy switch to e-learning. But some approaches that require, some programs that require expensive equipment do need something else. Or it's either expensive equipment or programs or occupations that have to do with people and people's behavior. So one example I like to give of that, of technology trying to do that, is nursing programs in US. So there is a virtual reality simulator or augmented reality simulator that leads nursing students through different situations. And this potentially is this is the cutting edge, I would say, in technology for TVET, of simulating the situations or simulating the equipment, and so students can actually interact with that equipment in remote learning modality. This is what I talk about when we discuss smart technologies. Again, some systems are much more prepared to invest in those than others. But this is definitely what I see the next wave of TVET technology.
Thank you very much. And there is another following question, actually, that if we are going to deliver these the learning online, and regardless whether we deliver it through the traditional e-learning or maybe through simulation or virtual reality, then how to assess that as well? Because the assessment itself is a bigger question right now, and I think this burning question is coming over the questions that I have seen here in the chat.
Yes, remote assessment, it has its very real challenges. So potentially the scenario-based assessments can happen virtually. Also, interview-based assessments can happen virtually. Like right now, we're having a sort of interview without being in the same place. So I think the Caribbean example that I used, I think that's what they're doing currently, or at least that's what they're trying to do, is having these virtual interviews instead of having face-to-face ones. So I think there are many creative approaches, but only time will tell the extent to which that they can be mainstreamed in TVET. Of course, remote assessments also involve issues of remote proctoring and privacy concerns, privacy confidentiality. Without remote proctoring, then there's the cheating and manipulation that can happen. So it's definitely an issue that we're thinking about very seriously here as well.
Thank you, Victoria. I'm mindful of the time, but I have many questions here. Mr. Abdulaziz Al-Malki, I see you raising your hand. Please go ahead and ask your question. Thank you. Can you unmute, please, Mr. Abdulaziz Al-Malki, so that you can ask your question? Thank you. So we have another question, actually, and maybe you mentioned something, Victoria, during your discussion around using blockchain to recognize skills. And this is an emerging technology that is coming to the picture, but the use of blockchain in education right now is being discussed in shy topics that you can find all over the internet. But using it as well as a ledger for recognizing and certifying skill is a totally different thing. Can you shed some light on that as well, please?
Well, I'm definitely not an expert in blockchain technology, but what I do know is that it can be used to track credentials and make sure that they are aligned with the right person. So, but we have a team in our education global practice that is working very seriously on this topic. And if the person who asked the question would like to, I can connect. I can connect them to that team to discuss it in more detail than I'm able to do.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the time. I think we almost at the end of the our webinar today, and I think the topic is very big. We cannot cover it in one session, and hopefully we will have a series of sessions around TVET, and this will not be the last one. Do you have a final note here, Victoria, about the topic actually? And we would like to close with your note about it to those who are in the field, those who are in accreditation, and those who have family and friends and members of the society who are in this field, and how can we think together as one system actually to help TVET during this crisis and maybe help it post that crisis. Thank you.
Of course, thank you so much. I think it is very important to see past the daily challenges of TVET these days. I think it is very challenging, and there are many different challenges in terms of access, in terms of quality, in terms of trying to deliver or trying to make sure that students are learning something. But I think looking past that and trying to grab whatever nuggets of experience and lessons from this experience will help us when we move on and when we actually make policy for TVET going forward. TVET is very well placed to contribute because its students are ready to contribute and they're willing to contribute to the workforce. So I think we need to think primarily of the current students and those that we can engage in education and training, both for their own benefit in terms of their earnings, but also for the benefit of the whole economy, so that the firms have the workers that they need and that the economy grows at a higher pace.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Victoria. We would like to thank you for giving us the time and for answering the questions and for presenting to us the presentation that we have today about TVET system responsiveness and the future of TVET in relation to COVID-19. Some members here asked about the report. Actually, the report is available in the public domain and it can be reached. And its name is TVET Systems Response to COVID-19. With that, actually, I would like to thank everyone who participated with us today in this webinar. I'd like to thank Victoria again all our respected guests who have been with us today. And please stay tuned for other webinars from ETIC around this very interesting topic, and we will keep you informed about the coming webinars, inshallah. Thank you very much. Thank you again, Victoria. Thank you.